Hello, everybody. Hey there. You are the first, Mike and Mary.
Howdy.
And now we're letting in everybody else. It's up to you. Shall we let these people in?
Yes.
The answer is yes. Why are people calling me at this moment? Well, there's Francine. You're calling me. Francine is calling me, and I'm telling you you're in, Francine. You don't have to call. You're in. You're in, Francine. You didn't have to get special permission. You're in. So, wow, we had 8 people rearing to go. Actually, more than that, because some of you are with other people. And and nobody is muted yet. So if you want to mute yourself, fine. If we start having, stuff we can't hear, we will raise the volume, or cut the volume, raise the volume accordingly. But we're going to give everybody a couple minutes to join in. It's we already have a minion, and everybody is staying healthy and doing well. We're going to we want to let people know that if you want, you can watch the. If you miss one, you can watch them because they are recorded. So last week's, it took a while. There was some problem with Zoom had so many people that were using it that they had to. It took them a while to deal with the amount of people, but they have everything up now. So we've posted them on Facebook, and you can go on or go through the Zoom, and I think one way or the other you'll be able to find it. But you'll definitely be able to find it on our Facebook page for the temple. We posted them up, so we'll give people a couple of moments to jump in. It's actually hard to. I sometimes don't notice people when they're coming in, and we've already started. So I apologize. If you ever come in late, don't be frustrated if it takes a moment to bring people in, to bring you in, because it's sometimes hard in the middle of something to do that. I guess if I had a helper, we could have another host that would be in charge of managing participation. That'd be really fancy. By the way, I want to let people know too that in addition to we're working really hard on Friday night service. Again, doing another, it will be different, by the way. Well, prayers will be the same, but there'll be different melodies, different people, different voices, different video accompaniment. And so it will be different. And so we're working hard on that. We are working on a Passover Seder that will be, we're going to do one for the temple, and we're also going to do another one for JLTV, for the network. We're putting together an interesting Seder that should have some special guests, some entertainment people, some politicians, it should be interesting. So we're working on that too. And some of you saw that we're going to be doing, well, not we, I'll help, but Tracy is doing a cooking class next weekend, or actually not next weekend, this coming Sunday on the 29th at 5:00. She's doing an online cooking class for Passover. So she's done these for a while with people there, but she's going to be doing one online, and that'll be Sunday. So we've got a lot of good stuff happening. We trying to do as much as we can with the resources that we have and with the technology we have to try to bring people together. So this is going to, tonight, we're going to start in just a moment. We'll give people another minute. We'll start. I know we've got some of our class, our Adult B'nai Mitzvah class. Welcome. We're glad you're here with us too. And we know you're studying Torah, you're studying your Torah portions. So we've got a bunch of people that are studying Torah. They're for their weekly portion. We'll just let a couple more of our class members in. That'll be in June, by the way. If you want to join. Somebody's got their volume up really high. We have that coming up June 6th. God willing, we'll be able to be out with everybody. So we're going to start. Welcome, everybody. We are going to start the Torah study tonight. We're going to be looking at the end of Exodus and the beginning of Leviticus today, going from Shemot to Vayikra, the second book of the Bible to the third book. So this is actually last week's portion and a little bit of this week's portion. Last week we were in Ki Tisa, which has a lot of material, so much. It's the golden calf story, and we're going to do something right now. We're actually going to look. There was an important part of the text that we did not get to last week, and we're gonna actually do a little tiny bit. I apologize, but I think you'll really find it interesting. We're going to do a little bit of the end of Exodus chapter 34, which is the last chapter of Ki Tisa. So we're actually stepping back, and this was the week that we weren't able to do class. This was 2 Wednesdays ago. And so we're going to take a look at that. And let's take a look. So this is Exodus chapter 34. Moses has just destroyed the 10 commandments. He, in anger for the golden calf, which is part of that story. And then it says that he went up and he took, he carved 2 tablets of stone like the first. And early in the morning, he went up to Mount Sinai. So he goes back up to Mount Sinai, taking 2 stone tablets with him. So a lot of people don't know this or remember this or think about this, that Moses actually, after he destroyed the commandments, he actually goes back up onto the mountain with the commandments ready to be chiseled, essentially. He's ready to go. He comes with the materials ready to transcribe, ready for dictation. And so this is an interesting thing, that he actually goes up there the second time with the commandments, ready to write the commandments. And it says here, the Lord came down in a cloud, and God stood with him there and proclaimed the name Lord, the Yud He Vav He name, the name we're not supposed to say. And it says the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun Erech Apayim v'Rav Chesed v'Emed, Notzar Chesed le'alafim, Nosei Avon v'Afesha v'Chata v'Nake. It's a section that we say at the high holidays when we open up the ark. We repeat those words. I don't know every part of the Torah as well as that part, but I know that part because we sing it every year at high holidays. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum v'Chanun Erech Apayim. So we sing this part because it's such a powerful section of this story, where we have this repetition or recognition or list of God's qualities, which include this idea that God most importantly, and compassionate, gracious, but what's really the theme here is forgiving, that God doesn't remember the bad things that we do. On the contrary, actually forgives and remembers to the kindness to the 1,000th generation, which, believe it or not, we'd still be under the 1,000th generation category of descendants of Moses and the people. So after the golden calf incident, he says that. Now it does say in this section, we don't read on high holidays, where it says, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the 3rd and 4th generations. So we don't say that part at the high holidays. It's the bad part of that line. It's one that we rather not think about, which is that there is a stain of of punishment that rests not just on the people who deserve it, but on a few generations after. It's an interesting thing to think about. It doesn't seem fair, but there does seem to be a truth to it. And if you don't believe it, talk to Germans and talk to people who are now the second and even in some cases the third generation of Germans who are still dealing with a terrible, in some cases, again, 2 or 3 generations removed, people who still have a stain of horrific crime on them. And so it's an interesting thing to think about. How long does this really stay with us? But again, it's not something we focus on. It's kind of it's obviously a sad thing, but it's kind of a powerful and tragic truth. So that's part of it here. But I want to go on a little bit further, where Moses and God are in this discussion, where God once again reminds Moses that this covenant will be with you, and I will drive out the nations in the land of Israel, the Amorites, the Canaanites. We have this famous list of the Canaanite people that are going to be there, and then we get into kind of why, which is that if they're not driven out, they will be a snare. They'll be a trap. They'll lead you into idolatry. And so you have to get rid of those people, and you have to get rid of their altars. Now, what's interesting about this is that most scholars believe this was written after the fact, after the Israelites did inhabit the land and were worshiping on Canaanite altars and were worshiping in Canaanite ways, which they weren't supposed to do. And it says specifically, you must not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for they will lust after their gods and sacrifices, and sacrifice to their gods and invite you, and you will eat of their sacrifices. And so it's basically telling the Israelites that if you don't get rid of them and their ways of life, you're gonna follow them. And it says, and when you take wives from their daughters for your sons, their daughters will lust after their gods and will cause your sons to lust after their gods. And so it's reminding us that through intermarriage, this is going to cause a problem for the Israelites. It's interesting to note that it says, and when you take wives, which seems to imply that it most definitely has happened already, that you have already had this problem. But here's where we start to see something interesting, which is, again, you must not make molten gods for yourselves. You shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, Pesach. It's coming up. Every first issue of the womb is mine. It's the law of Pinyon Haben. 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th you shall cease. It's the law of Shabbat. You shall observe the feast of weeks, Shavuot. So you can see these are laws that we haven't had articulated yet. And people have noticed that what we seem to have here, you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, and the sacrifice of the feast of Passover shall not be left lying until morning. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. The very famous line of we've already read earlier in Exodus of not mixing milk and meat, or again, we derive that we're not supposed to do it in any form because it's written 3 times in the Bible. But then we look at this line. And the Lord said to Moses, write down these commandments, for in accordance with these commandments, I make a covenant with you and Israel. And this is where we have a little bit of a difficulty, because these are not the 10 commandments that were on the 10 commandments before. So what are these commandments? These seem to be, some people have pointed out, ritual commandments. Whereas in the first set of commandments, really the only ritual we have is to keep Shabbat. Here we have a list of commandments that are not the same commandments. So, look, some people say it's a different author. There's a different, this is a different set of commandments that God gives us. And what's interesting about these commandments is that it says specifically that these are the commandments. And actually, specifically, and he was there for 40 days and 40 nights. He ate no bread and no water. And he wrote down on the tablets the terms of the covenant, the 10 commandments. And we don't even have this term in Exodus chapter 20. When we get the first version of the 10 commandments, they're not even called there the 10 commandments. So it's an interesting question, really, that, it's a tough one. Why do we have two sets of 10 commandments? And the reality is we have another version of it in Deuteronomy, but the Deuteronomy version is almost a complete repetition with a couple differences to Exodus chapter 20. So we really have three sets of commandments, of 10 commandments in the Torah, which is interesting. But this one is different than the versions that are in the other two, Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 4. So it's an interesting, I mean, a lot of people don't want to talk about it because it's a challenge. It's a problem. There's not an easy answer for this. And this is the section that I wanted you to see in particular. And I didn't bring this to you just so you would see that there's another set of 10 commandments. I wanted you to see this section that some people know, but a lot of people don't know. And a lot of people don't know it because it's another very difficult part of the Torah. It requires people to kind of scratch their head and try to figure out why is it here. And you've never seen it in the movies because it wouldn't make for very good video or film. So here's what it says. Moses came down from Mount Sinai, now with the second set, bearing the two tablets of the pact. Moses was not aware that the skin of his face was radiant, since he had spoken with him, with God. And Aaron and all the Israelites saw that the skin of Moses' face was radiant, and they shrank from coming near him. Before we move on, this is where we get the word, the Hebrew phrase is keren or, rays of light. The problem is the word keren also means horns. So horns of light is sometimes the way it's translated, but the word keren usually means horns. And this is why we have the statue of Moses with horns, why he's depicted with horns, because it says keren or. Now, it doesn't say that he had horns. It says he had horns of light. But was it horns of light? Was it something that's sticking out because of the light? Some people say that what we actually see here are protrusions or something that's coming off of his face that was because he came in contact with this light. The reason that people have an issue with this, and I mean, I don't mean an issue. There's so many questions here of what's going on. So the translation here seems to imply that what happened to Moses was that he was radiant, that he was shining, and that he was beautiful. But the text clearly says that they shrank from coming near him, that they were scared of him. Now, some people interpret that because they were in awe of him, that he was like God almost when he came down off of Mount Sinai the second time. But other people have said, look, if you really read what happens here, Moses isn't transfigured, he's disfigured. That he actually comes down and the people are scared of the way he looks. They can't look at him without being frightened. And that completely goes against every reading of the Bible that we normally hear or see versions of, because nobody wants to see this happen to Charlton Heston or Ben Kingsley or Burt Lancaster or anybody else who's ever played Moses before. They don't want to see a disfigured Moses. And so here we have a troubling and confusing text, which I at least want to bring to your attention because it's something you may not have heard, you may not remember, you may never have seen this before. And I just want to show you the end of this. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the chieftains in the assembly returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. Afterwards, all the Israelites came near, and he instructed them concerning all that the Lord had imparted to him on Mount Sinai. So he taught everybody. And then it says, and when Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. And that is that's the literal translation. He put a veil over himself, over his face. Panav, that's clearly his face.
The golden calf
What?
have horns. The golden calf horns.
Did the golden calf have horns?
Yeah.
I could, Scott. I'm not getting you real clear.
Yeah, that's the question. The golden calf have horns. Hear me?
No, it's not coming. Can you type? Can you type what you're saying? Yeah, just type it for me, Scott.
I'm waiting for it.
Yeah, it's coming through all weird. I apologize. It could be from my computer. I don't know. Or could be too many people on Zoom right now. Not from our group, but just too many people on Zoom completely. So if I get that from Scott, I'll put it out there. So it says, whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would leave the veil off until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, the Israelites would see how radiant the skin of Moses' face was. Moses would then put the veil back over his face and put the veil back over his face when he went in to speak with him, until he went to speak with him. So he put it on when he went to talk to the people, and he took it off when he spoke to God. God didn't need it. So yeah, what Scott was asking was, did the golden calf have horns? If so, maybe Moses was marked by the sin. Yeah, that there's a poetic connection to the horns of the golden calf. Listen, it says the words again, Karen or. The phrase, the two words Karen or are used again here in Hebrew. And so, look, would the horns have come out like would the horns have come out like would they have come out as rays? Is that the word for ray? It's possible, but it does seem that there's almost something physically to his face that it doesn't make the people feel comfortable. Let's put it that way. So yeah, maybe it was some type of horns, but again, this is where we get the legend or the weird anti-Semitic, feeling that Jews had horns. This is where it comes from. It comes from the statue, and it comes from Moses having horns. That all Jews had horns. I think that's kind of strange because what we definitely come away with here is that whatever happened to Moses was unique to Moses. The other people didn't have it, and they weren't scared by it. They didn't have it. They didn't have something they were scared of on themselves. It's what Moses has after his meeting with God. And the crazy thing is this isn't at the beginning of the journey. This isn't at the end of the journey. This is at the beginning. This is in the first, this is for the next 38 years. Moses is wearing a veil when he talks to the people. It's hard to wrap our heads around it because it totally goes against our image of Moses when he speaks to the people. But this idea that he had this barrier between them, look, I think it's a little strange though that we're reading this just as people are walking around with masks all over the place. Think about what a mask does, because you see it now all the time. People wearing masks. Think about what that does for communication. Think about what that does for intimacy, and forget intimacy, just basic human interaction when somebody's wearing a mask. It's an interesting coincidence that we're reading this right at this time. And to consider that Moses had this barrier between him and the people pretty much for the remainder of the next 40 years of his life. What was that like for Moses to have that? So again, I didn't want to miss this. I definitely don't want to miss this and not talk about it until next year. Well, hopefully by next year, this is going to be a bad memory, but that's the last words of the portion. You can see chapter 35 is the portion of Vayakhel, which we read last week, which we're going to look at now. Any other points or questions or anything? Please unmute and jump in if you got something to add.
Rabbi, what it says though is that he does have the veil off when he comes out and gives the commandments from God, and then it says the Israelites would see how radiant his skin was. So it seems like this is a way that the Israelites can tell that he's actually relaying what God said and not, putting in his own stuff.
Yeah, an interesting point Rosemary is making, that this is maybe what the people needed after losing faith in Moses when he was up on Mount Sinai, that this was, the people knew that he's speaking directly from God with that sense, but of the deity actually, rubbing off on him. But the interesting thing I think about it is that the people were afraid of him. And again, they're afraid of God. I mean, so it's not when they actually are in the presence of God at Mount Sinai, they're afraid of him. So, it could be the power of it. But the fact that he has to wear the veil it's kind of mind-blowing, because it's not what we imagine Moses looking like. We don't in our minds, we don't see a lot of depictions of Moses with that veil. Hardly any artists have ever captured this. I'm talking about through the Middle Ages, church art. You very rarely see pictures of Moses with a veil on, very rarely. And in our minds, probably again because of the movies that we've seen, we just don't have that. It almost, again, it's hard for us to even wrap our minds around this fact that Moses was wearing a veil for the rest of his life, except again when he comes into contact with God and speaks on behalf of God. So yeah, I mean, it's a strange, it's a strange image, but it really is a kind of an amazing responsibility, burden that Moses had for the rest of his life, that he had to wear this mask or veil. So then let's move into Vayakhel. And so these last chapters of Exodus, which let's see, I'll show you right now. So if you look at Exodus, one second. So if we look at Exodus, we just finished when we went into chapter 35 here. Let me just show this. These last chapters, 35 through 40, these last 6 chapters are Vayakhel Pekudei, which we as we did this year, last week, and ended Saturday. We read those 6 chapters together as a double portion. And what's interesting about the double portion of Vayakhel is that there is this feeling that a lot of people have, and it's been articulated through the generations. Why do we even have these 2 portions? Why are these 2 portions? Why are these 2 portions, Vayakhel and Pekudei? Why are they even here? Because they're repetitions of Teruma and Tetzaveh. They're almost word for word repetitions of the double portion that comes before Kitisa. So the one that we actually read, 3 weeks ago. It's a really interesting point that has been made by traditional rabbis for a long time. Now, before we even get into that issue, though, let's just look at the name of the portion. It's Vayakel, which means, and it says Vayakel Moshe. Moses convoked the Israelite community and said to them, "These are the things that Moses commanded you to do." And then it's a reminder of the law of Shabbat, and then then goes into take from among you the gifts of the Lord. Goes through that same list that we had in Truman Tetzaveh, and so it goes through this long list of things here, and it says, and the whole community of Israelites left Moses' presence. And everyone who excelled in ability and everyone whose spirit moved him came bringing to the Lord his offering for the work of the tent of meeting, for all its service and sacred vestments. And it says, men and women, all whose hearts moved them, all who would make an elevation offering to God, they brought their jewelry, they brought all their precious stuff, and they brought their precious garments, all these precious things. And it says that the women spun with their own hands, and the women, you can see, did these things, and the chieftains. And it says the Israelites, all the men and women whose hearts moved them to bring anything, they brought it as a free will offering to the Lord, which is what it says it's supposed to be. The Truma is supposed to be a free will offering. And so it says that again, Bezalel makes the things, and Aholiav, he helps him with it. And then it says, in this line right here, verse 5 of chapter 36, and Moses said, the people are bringing more than is needed for the task entailed in the work that the Lord had commanded to be done. Whereupon Moses had this proclamation made throughout the camp: let no man or woman make further effort towards gifts for the sanctuary. So the people stopped bringing. Their efforts had been more than enough for all the tasks to be done. So what we learn in these chapters is that the people responded. They came out. And not only did they come out and respond and do what Moses and God had instructed them to do, but they gave more than was needed. Moses literally has to say, "Genug, enough. We don't have a need for anything more." So, people always joke that, they wish every synagogue, every Jewish organization had the same problem, that people brought more than was needed. But no Jewish community has ever had to do the exact work that God spoke to them, and instructed them to make. I mean, if we could tell people, hey, this is what God wants, and this is only what God wants, I'm sure we'd get a very good reaction from all of you. I'm certain of it. So there is a different task. There's a different mission here to make this mishkan, to make the sanctuary, to make the things for the priests. What's interesting about this, though, is that this mishkan, this tabernacle, the ark, much of the stuff, maybe not the ark, but most of the stuff that's going to be used is not supposed to be used for that long. Now, of course, we know it ends up being used for 40 years, but it's not supposed to be used for 40 years. It's actually made only for the people while they're getting from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land, which should have taken months. It actually does take months for them to get to the Promised Land. The problem, of course, is that in the story in Numbers with the spies, they end up not being able to go in, but they get to the Promised Land. I mean, they literally get to the other side of the Jordan River. So ostensibly, all this stuff, all these directions for the Mishkan were only supposed to have been used for a few months. They were not supposed to be used forever. Now, again, maybe some of it would have been brought into the temple to be used later. But listen, what we know, of course, from the Torah is that it is used for 40 years in the wilderness. And then it's used for a couple hundred years later. That for about 200 years, these holy things were brought around the country and used in different places by the Israelites while they were waiting for the Mishkan, for the Mikdash, Beit HaMikdash to be built. So to get the final temple takes until the time of King David and King Solomon. So this temporary structure ends up not being so temporary, and it ends up serving the people for a very long time. So it's an interesting thing to consider. One of the points that I know Ronnie made, and one of the things I like to remind people every year, is that we have all these chapters about the construction of the ark. And again, to give people a understanding of how much that is, we're basically here from Exodus chapter 24 all the way to 40. This is all construction of the Mishkan and Tabernacle, with the exception of the story of the golden calf and getting the second set of 10 commandments. But almost everything else in those last 15 chapters is the construction. So you can see it's a good third. I mean, it's over a third of the book of Exodus. I mean, if you take out the chapters of Ki Tisa, it's still a third of the book of Exodus. And as Ronnie's point, as Ronnie made the point, look, we have one chapter in the Torah about the creation of the universe. We have all these chapters about the making of the Mishkan, what should have been a temporary sanctuary. But let's go to back to the very beginning of chapter 35. And that is these words. Vayakel Moshe, Moses assembled the people. And what's interesting about this phrase, Vayakel Moshe, is it's very, very repetitious of the line that we read, that we studied just last week, which is right here, chapter 32. Let's look at this word at the very beginning of the golden calf story. When the people saw that Moses was coming down for the mountain, he was not coming down right away. It says, Vayikahel ha'am, that the people gathered, and then it says al aharon, that they gathered in front of Aaron. So here we have the people gathered, Vayikahel, and in Exodus chapter 35, we have Vayakel, and Moses assembled. The singular, that Moses assembled the people. And it has been pointed out that there's a difference here. That when the people are gathered together by Moses, they're gathered together for a common purpose, to finish the work that was laid out in Truma and Tetzaveh. That God calls the people, that Moses and God call the people together for a common mission, for a common event, and that they're gathered together by a leader, by God, by Moses, but there's direction. And so it's an interesting difference. The same word, the same root, assemble, gather together. And we use the same root, by the way, for kahal, for a congregation. It's the Hebrew word for, or one of the Hebrew words for a synagogue, for a community, is kahal. Synagogues sometimes called kahal or kehilat, like Kehilat Israel in Palisades. It means congregation. So sometimes a congregation or a community or an assembly has a common purpose, and sometimes it's a mob. And so it's been pointed out that when the people gather in the first place for the golden calf, they're a mob. They gathered themselves and they kind of came together as a mob. Here, they're brought together. And it's an interesting difference because we see it in our own time. And it's also pretty powerful that we're reading these sections when we're social distancing, when we're not supposed to be assembling at all. We're thinking about all the things that have been canceled because we're not supposed to assemble. The concerts, the political, assemblies and rallies and debates that have been postponed. I mean, some really important things. There's concerts and sporting events, entertainment. There have been opportunities that people have not been able to take part in over these last weeks. And think about those events. For the most part, when we gather together as a group, we know where we're going to be. We come at a scheduled time. We have an artist or performer or leaders or some direction in how we come together. And those are usually pretty good events. Those are events where people have a good time. People are usually safe. They may not always agree, or they may not always have exactly the same agenda, but we've had great masses of people march on Washington. We've had events where people have come together and literally hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes even 1 million people, have come together with a common purpose, and it usually works out okay. But I mean, you can get 50 or 100 people together, and if they're not there with, if they kind of are more of a mob, they can do a lot of damage. And we've seen that happen too in our own lifetime, in recent years, we've seen that. And when we think about the differences, and you can think about some of those differences of assemblies of people, the Torah really kind of gives us two models of assembly being assembled, by leaders with common mission, and then just a mob coming together. And think about, where people have been hurt and have died in mobs and in situations where oftentimes you have competing mobs, you have competing groups that are confronting each other. It's an interesting lesson, and again, the Torah gives us the two examples almost right next to each other, literally just a couple chapters apart. How different the outcomes are, because look what happens when the people come together. Here is they're able to do something amazing. They're able to build the Mishkan. They're able to build this holy sanctuary, this holy area, these holy things that they get to build. Not that God gave them, but that they actually built. And interestingly, we see what happens when they build something they shouldn't have built, the golden calf. So the juxtaposition of the golden calf with the Mishkan is really important. It's not an accident. It's there. We're confronted with both examples, even if it's even if it's an authorship question. It's an amazing story because of the juxtaposition of those two stories, of the golden calf and the Mishkan. And again, what happens? The people bring more than it's even needed. And what's wonderful about it is that the people do it. It's not done for them. I mean, obviously it says that a lot of the work was done by Bezalel, a lot of the design, maybe even he worked on the blueprints, but we see that women in the community, which again, we understand it's a patriarchal society. The Torah is very explicit that women helped make the Mishkan, that they did it with their own hands. And it really is a great lesson for us on coming together and building something together with our own hands. It's something that, that we've taken seriously at our synagogue. We try to, when we fix up the synagogue, we try to bring people together. It's one of the things that churches have done very successfully, whether they're Amish or even the Jehovah's Witnesses, who actually built our building in the first place. They do all the work themselves. They don't use contractors. Jehovah's Witnesses all do the work. They do all the work themselves. And it is a great lesson, because it's the difference, if you will, between something that is given to people, something that they rely on somebody else to build for them, and then something that they willingly do themselves, and something that they collaborate on course, it's just common sense that people have greater pride in what they create. They have a greater ownership of it. They have a greater connection to it. It means more to them rather than the state providing it for them. It's really kind of the difference between the state versus society too, where, you know, society, and one of the great things that we've had in our country and hopefully will continue, is this idea that and again, it's, you know, it's I guess famously embodied in John Kennedy's, you know, ask not what, you know, we can give you, but what you can do yourselves, right? This is really this is the message of I think what has made America great over the years, is that we understand that we work together, you know, that we shouldn't expect the government to provide for us the things that really are the fabric of our society, that we have to do the work ourselves, and we'll have greater pride in it. So this has been pointed out for centuries, since really the beginning of our country. It wasn't just Kennedy who pointed out. The founding framework, you know, the founding fathers and mothers of our country also articulated this hope that we would have a society rather than just a state. So I mean, kind of keep that in mind as we think about community, and especially in these days, what it is to be part of a community, which is, again, one of the wonderful translations for kahal is to use the word community, not just an assembly or a congregation. Just kind of it's a neutral word, but community really is a positive word. I can't think of many times when people have ever used community in a negative way. Any people want to comment on that beginning part? Any people want to jump in? Yes, no?
I only wanted to remark that unfortunately right now we have community spread.
Yeah, we do. And, you know, when we come back together, it'll be interesting to see whether, you know, what's the legacy of this? What will be the long-term consequence of this? I mean, we know that when we've come together, unfortunately, we usually come together as a country to battle, you know, external enemies and war, and to come together against, well, we usually come together for negative reasons, but when we come together in this situation, it'll be interesting to see what type of feelings, you know, what type of what the repercussions will be. Will there be a will there be a bounce back where people will want to be around people more after they've been apart from each other? Will people have, I don't want to say positive memories, but there is this kind of, you know, will people say, you know, I don't want to, I mean, a lot of people are talking about it and we're in the midst of it. So to even think about it it's definitely premature, but will people say, hey, you know, we've seen some of the best of humanity in these last days. And so far we have. I mean, I hope it stays that way. So far we really have, I think for the most part, seen that. I mean, obviously there's examples of people, you know, hitting each other and fighting in Costco parking lots and stuff, but that's really been the exception.
There's also, oh, go on.
No.
There's also a movement right out here in Ventura to make masks. A lot of, I don't know why I'm getting feedback. A lot of women and anybody who sews has been working together to make masks for the nurses.
Yeah.
It even got into the New York Times.
Was that? Yeah, I saw that. I didn't realize that was in Ventura.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And did you see the medical students at UCLA are going to the front lines?
Yes. We're seeing that we've seen that in a few PDs. We've seen students, medical students, uh, service or volunteered for service. Yeah, it's easy to talk about the spring breakers, but that's not the majority of students. Definitely wasn't my daughters, by the way, over this time. They did not. Um, in any irresponsible stuff. And again, it's not like, we're not going to say everybody, but please jump in too. Philip, you want to say something?
No, I had nothing to say.
Okay, well, you can say something anyways. I don't know. Now you have tricked you. You did. Okay. So this is again this discussion of community and the differences in community is it's an interesting and relevant, poignant lesson for us now. And again, it is these portions that finish up the discussion in Exodus of the Mishkan are they're the good side. This is the good side. This is where in the first two portions in Truma and Tetzaveh, the introductory portions where we get the list of what you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to make, it says, and you will do. And here in this section, over and over again, we'll just to show you one, it says they made loops. It says vayas, and vayas is used over and over again. There's vayas, I mean, almost every verse, and they made. And it's almost as if every time we hear the word and they made, vayas, that it's an affirmation that they made it. Not only did they make it, which is wonderful that they did it themselves, but it's an affirmation that they did what they were supposed to do. And after reading this horrible story of the golden calf, of people being kind of at their worst, that we read about them being at their best, that they did what they did what they were supposed to do, that they were actually completing the work. And and everybody knows whenever you've had something that, even if it's not your choice, even if it's, you're following direction from somebody else, when you finish the work yourself, that sense of fulfillment, that sense of that we did it is a great feeling. It's a feeling that even though we're reading it thousands of years later, there's something about this that is, it's, even though it's our ancestors generations ago, there's a feeling of pride in it. There's a feeling of yeah, we did that. We made it. And it's a wonderful thing to read. Again, it's a long list of it's an accounting of everything, which again seems redundant given that we've been told that this is what they're supposed to do. But the Torah teaches us in this redundancy that you can get directions, but it doesn't mean that you're going to follow directions. And when you follow the directions, and when you've done what you're supposed to do, even again, you're doing only what you're supposed to do, there is something special about that, because people don't always do that, and they didn't always do it. And so there's something really special about reading this, almost again, as if we're saying, yeah, this is what we were supposed to do, and then we did it. And so this is this is something to think about as we read these the completion of these things. I want to point out too, there's also a point of why we have this counting of it. And so the first part of it's called Vayakel, and the second part of it, again, sometimes when we have enough weeks where we have to split up the portions that we, like we did this year, read together, when we have the Vayakel and Pekudei read separately, and here's where Pekudei starts. It says specifically, these are the records of the tabernacle of the pact, which were drawn up at Moses' bidding, the work of the Levites under the direction of Ithamar, the son of Aaron the priest. And then the word pekude then means the records, that this is the record of the tabernacle. This is the accounting of it. And so it's been pointed out that the reason we also have this section is so that no one would accuse Moses of putting a little bit in his own pocket. That we need to have this accounting so that it's very clear that Moses didn't take even a nail from it. This is what they were supposed to do. This is what they did, and this is the accounting of it. And so there is this sense that there should be an accounting. There should be an audit, if you will, of the work. And so even in this holy work of doing what God wanted us to do, there needed to be an accounting. There needed to be somebody, there needed to be a record of it so that nobody would be thought of as being, of taking advantage of the situation and of slipping a little bit inside. For people who've done work in construction and specifically in New York, that's just was part of doing business back east. And it's not just back east; it was here too. But it was the graft that went on in construction was very well known. And again, unfortunately, it happens in religious institutions to this very day. So there we have this accounting, and this is the last verses of this are not just that they were built, but this is how much they were valued at. The silver of the community who were recorded came of those of the community who were recorded came to 100 talents and 1,775 shekels by sanctuary weight. It goes through a half shekel a head, a half shekel by sanctuary weight for each one who entered in the records from ages 20 and up. So you have this list of what was done and what was the value of it. I mean, it's pretty detailed, and people have often noted that for all the Jewish accountants out there, that this was also a good lesson in why we have accountants. So there is a purpose and a need, not just for the tax purposes, but so that people know that we've done what we've said we would do. And especially for religious institutions, it's very important that people have faith that the money that they've given goes to what it's supposed to go towards. Let's go a little bit towards the end. So here we're going to finish up with the end of this chapter, and we're going to finish up with the end of Exodus together right now, and then we'll read the beginning of Leviticus. So it says right here we go through the altar, and it also says to anoint the laver, the bowl, the washing bowl. And then it says, you shall bring Aaron and his sons forward to the entrance of the tent of meeting and wash them with the water out of the laver, out of the bath. Put the sacral vestments on Aaron, anoint him and consecrate him, that he may serve me as priest. Then bring his sons forward and put tunics on them and anoint them as you have anointed their father, that they may serve me as priests. This their anointing shall serve them for everlasting priesthood throughout the ages. And Moses did just as the Lord had commanded him, so he did. In the first month of the second year, on the first month, the tabernacle was set up. Moses set up the tabernacle, placing its sockets, setting up its planks, inserting its bars, and erecting its posts. He spread the tent over the tabernacle, placing the covering of the tent on top of it, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. He took the pact and placed it in the ark. He fixed the poles to the ark and placed the cover on top of the ark, and brought the ark inside the tabernacle. Then he put the curtain for the screen and screened off the pact, just as the Lord had commanded him. He placed the table in the tent of meeting outside the curtain on the north side of the tabernacle, and upon it he laid the setting of the bread before the Lord, as the Lord had commanded. He placed the lampstand, the menorah, opposite the table on the south side of the tabernacle, and he lit the lamps before the Lord, as the Lord had commanded him. And then he put the altar there. He burnt incense on it, and he put the laver, the washing bowl, in front of the altar. And from it, Moses and Aaron and his sons would wash their hands and feet. They washed when they entered the tent of meeting and when they approached the altar. So again, you can see they had to have the bowl there so that they could wash. And it says that Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it. And the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out for their various journeys. But if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out. And it says in the last lines, for over the tabernacle, a cloud of the Lord rested by day, and fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. And that's the last line. That's the last line of Exodus. That's the last line in the story of how they got to where they are at this point, which is at Mount Sinai, about to set out on the rest of their journeys. Now, there's a couple things. Now they have a priesthood ready to go. They have the things set up for them. And that sets us up for the book of Leviticus that's going to follow. They also have the ark. And so it tells us quite specifically that the ark, inside the ark, he placed the pact, placed it in the ark. So he took the 10 Commandments, he took the tablets, and he put them in the ark.
So, Mark,
Yes, I'm waiting.
in other words, they actually camped at the foot of Mount Sinai for a year.
Yep. That's another important point of this is how long they were there for, and where they are still, because they're going to be there at the beginning of Leviticus too. Not just the beginning of Leviticus. When we open the book of Leviticus, they're there. And
Yeah.
when we open Leviticus, they're there. So the entire book of Leviticus takes place there as well. So Mount Sinai is a long experience. It's not just getting the 10 Commandments. It's not just the golden calf. It's not just getting the second set of 10 Commandments. It's not just building the Mishkan, but it's the entire book of Leviticus that follows. It's a long time at the foot of Mount Sinai. And so it's a special place because all of these things happen there. But it's also a place where the people, by the time they leave, they're spiritually ready for their journey. And of course, as we know, it's not going to be the journey that maybe they thought it would be, that Moses thought it would be, that Aaron thought it would be, that God thought it would be. I don't know how far we want to go with that, but we know that this time at Mount Sinai,
Off this light that's by the fireplace. Please.
we know that Mount Sinai was supposed to be,
I want to see. I look like a ghost on here.
we heard that, but the important thing is that the people want, people need to be ready to go for the rest of their journey. Okay. And in order for it to happen, in order for this journey to happen, they need to be spiritually prepared. So assumedly, a good chunk of their journey to Egypt, from Egypt to the promised land, would have been at Mount Sinai. Instead, it winds up only being 1/40th of the time, a little over 1/40th of the time. But it wasn't supposed to be that way. What we kind of take away from this is it maybe should have been, maybe even half the time would have been at Mount Sinai. It would have been a huge part of their journey. So it winds up being, again, the most important part of their journey, the longest place that they're at, with the exception of where they finish up at when they're not ready to come in. They essentially are in that area on the Jordan side of the Jordan River for a long time. But it's the longest single place that they're stationed at that they should have been stationed at. So it is an important point that this is a place that actually would have been proportionally wise, an even bigger part of their journey, if the journey had gone the way it was supposed to have gone. But the interesting thing here, I thought you were going to mention, Ronnie, is that we have a line here, which is that he took the pact and he placed it in the ark. So the question is, which 10 commandments did he put in the ark? It doesn't say. The assumption is that he took the second set. But we have an important midrash, an important lesson, teaching, that Moses actually took both sets, the broken set and the whole set. And he took the broken set so that the people would remember how they broke the 10 commandments immediately at Mount Sinai.
I thought they put both in the ark.
That's what I said.
The Holy of Holies.
Yeah, that's what I said, that he had both copies. It doesn't say that, but that's the understanding that we have, that he took both sets, the whole set and the broken set. And the broken set was a reminder of how they failed. So that both of these were there. And so when we come to the end of the Torah portion, we say, Tam v'neshalem tehillah le'el borei olam. We give praise and thanks to God, the creator of everything. We can also say, Chazak, Chazak, v'ni chazek. Be strong, let all of us be strengthened, especially now, to be strong and to take the strength of our ancestors and the knowledge that they had, that they did what they were supposed to do, which we they didn't always have, we don't always have, but that there is a wonderful feeling of completion and of fulfilling a mission, which hopefully we do have, and we've had it many times as a nation, we've had it as Americans, and we have it. We've had it as Jews. We've had it to some extent, especially in the last 70 years with Israel. Even though the project of building Israel is definitely not finished, and safe, secure Israel is not. It's not finished, but there's a tremendous sense of accomplishment that Jews take not only in Israel, but those outside of Israel, in what Israel has established and what Israel has built. There's a sense, there's a tremendous sense of pride that we have in the infrastructure that's built there and that continues to be built. We hope that it will be built for peace and for the benefit of lots of people, not just in Israel, in the Middle East, but around the world. And I will tell you that we need to get more of that in our country as well. We've had very, very few times, unfortunately, in the last 40, 50 years, where we've had that sense of accomplishment as Americans. And I will put out there that the last time we really felt that way was when we got people to the moon. And I will tell you, we've never, I haven't seen in my lifetime, and again, I was very young when we were landing people on the moon, but there's been very little that we've done as a nation where we've been able to take that kind of pride and say, we did that. That's something that we did as a people, as a nation. And it's really important to do that. There's no way of expressing that sense of accomplishment in words even, because it's a feeling that people have, and we need to have that. We need to have more of that in our country, and it's not a minor thing. It's not a political thing. It's not. Somebody want to jump in, please.
Kermit? Mark, can you hear me?
I don't know why I can't hear you. Do you hear me? Scott, you want to type it through again? I don't know why.
Yeah. Mark? No.
It's not coming through. Send it text, chat it again. Chat it again. I don't know why. Are you using a dial-up modem? Maybe you've got a. I'm hearing every other word. Just chat it over. Chat it over. Ronnie, were you going to jump in with something?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. You were unmuted, but chat it over, Scott. I want to put it out there. So a national project would be wonderful for us to take pride in. It doesn't have to be landing people on other planets or on the moon, but it would be wonderful if we had something we could point to with pride and say, that's something we did as Americans. And it's not, again, sometimes we look at, we rebuilt a tall building at ground zero, but I think for a lot of people, it's at least connected to the fact that we're rebuilding something that we lost. And of course we can never really rebuild that and get that back. So from Scott, I wanted to say about Apollo, we didn't know how to build a rocket to the moon again because no one wrote down the instruction pamphlet. He's got for doing that. Yeah.
Check the Bible.
we don't have a good accounting of it, but we do have we have some wonderful movie versions of it. But and there actually are some wonderful movie versions of those.
You weren't there though, Mark. You weren't born yet.
I was born. I was very, very young, but I do remember my parents telling me, trying to get me to watch it at night, telling me that this is going to be something that you can tell your grandkids about. And what's sad is that I think when I was a kid, I thought that we would do something bigger by then, even by then.
Hey, Mark, we have the Space Force now.
Listen, look, I mean, people can joke about that. I would love to see something that's not, that's real, where people can say we're doing this. And again, maybe space is a bad example. Maybe people will deride it and say we've already done it. But
How about people coming together to get through this pandemic?
Well, I think people will. But you know what? My guess is that they're not going to have the same thing that the same feeling that I think being reactive or responding, I think that's kind of the same feeling that people had a positive feeling on their reaction to 9/11, which is our last time that we came together as a nation. But responding to crisis or responding to tragedy is very important. I'm not diminishing it, but there's something about doing something proactively, that giving ourselves something that we can come together around is really, really cool. And it's what we do with the Mishkan.
Rabbi Mark,
Yeah.
it was, I don't know if you saw the video in Vancouver of everybody cheering for the medical workers.
Yeah.
It really gave such a sense of community. Of course, it's a different type of city because there are so many apartments and people are closer together, so that they could really do that.
Well, I think, just seeing how people are responding to people working in grocery stores right now, and
Right.
Look, these are not necessarily people that we recognize as heroes on a daily basis. I mean, some of them have even joked about it, that people usually look at us like this is the least necessary work, but we do. Now we have an appreciation for it. So those are definitely the way we respond as a community. We do see the best in humanity. But again,
I think a lot of parents are appreciating teachers a lot more too,
I think
because they're going crazy.
as a retired teacher, I think people recognize that this is not. People are, they joke about it, but they really do recognize how difficult it is.
Well, my daughter-in-law sent a text saying it was the first day of teaching at home, and she wanted to know how to get some kids out of her classroom.
Who do I send these kids to?
Right.
No principal to send them to.
I think as a nation, we experienced great pride when we elected the first Black president.
Well, I think there's an interesting thing. There's times when we feel a sense of, I can tell you there were a lot of people who felt that way. There's no question.
And we're paying the backlash for it now.
That I knew somebody was, I knew we're going to move off of this, but I think when we have things that are, oh, look, there's people who don't believe we ever went to the moon, right? But
Right.
when we talk about the things that bring us together as a nation, we definitely feel it when we react to tragedy. But it really would be good if we did more that was not that was something where we could say, and you know, my guess is that no matter what we do, somebody's going to say, well, we shouldn't have spent the money on that. We shouldn't have spent the money, you know, we shouldn't have done that. We shouldn't have, even if, again, it's getting people to something we do in space. People are going to say, well, that's a bad use of money. And whether it's an infrastructure or something, usually, you know, when we build a bridge or we build something, people say, well, yeah, it's good for the people that live there. It doesn't do anything for me. So it's really hard for us to do. I will tell you that that's not the case in some countries. I mean, partly it's because there are countries that you know, that I'm going to give a bad example maybe, but when China builds a unfortunately it's usually a dam, but when they build a national project that's the biggest or the most you know, the longest bridge or the biggest, they take a great sense of pride in it. Even the people who don't live in that area and who aren't getting the benefit from it feel a sense of pride from it. Again, you can make the argument that those are, you know, you're dealing with an authoritarian society, but it really is interesting to see that, because I don't see that a lot. I don't see that a lot in our country, and I have seen it in Israel. I've seen Israel when they're able to build a new bridge or get it. They just finished a new railroad connection between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and that obviously benefits lots of people. But there's a sense of national pride when people can do it. Interestingly, by the way, obviously in Israel, and not to be political about it, but look, Israelis are not happy that they had to build a security wall. They really aren't. But it is a feat of engineering to be able to do that and to do it as quick as they did. But it's definitely not something that they're happy about doing. Nobody says this is the way they wanted to have a wall like that. So it's a national project that's kind of, again, not a great one, but not a great example of something positive. But people understood that for most people in Israel, they said, we have to have this. And so, again, these are political issues. Sometimes they spill into politics, but think about it. I mean, think about those things that make us feel a sense of national pride. And I think all of us can at least agree that we need more of those. We need to have more. We need to have more pride in what we do as a nation.
Maybe if somebody had to risk their life to put up the GPS system and the Hubble telescope and the internet, we would appreciate them more. Because think about what your life would be like if you didn't have those things.
You're absolutely right, Rosemary. And for somebody whose husband worked as an engineer for many years, right, and a lot of those people here, Kelly just messaged over that one of her father's good friends was the first to drive a lunar vehicle on the moon, Dr. David Scott, that when you think about those people, even the people who went up to the moon, you know, it's been so long that we forget that after a while, we kind of we didn't even care anymore. We got jaded, another moon landing. But you're right. There's so many things that went into that and things that we did on every one of those missions that continue to help us. And so it is hard for us to even put into perspective the things that we have done. You're absolutely right, Rosemary. There's things that we have had that we can't see them, or we don't understand we don't understand how important they were to us. We don't understand their value and how lucky we are to have them. Again, as you said, people oftentimes are not they don't see it and they don't feel that risk that people have with that. You know, with those types of missions. But I will tell you, as somebody who follows NASA and has followed the space program, a lot of people know I went to the launching, unfortunately, the last launching of Columbia, and it was an amazing thing to see. I mean, we got so we started thinking that we stopped keeping track of every time we launched the space shuttle. It was partly because, again, people didn't feel it was ambitious enough. And we were reminded that every time those people left and went into space, Challenger and Columbia, that they were risking their lives, that this was a tremendously dangerous thing to do. So, and that's part of the reason we're not doing it anymore. So with that, I want to move on to Vayikra. to this week's portion, to the beginning of Leviticus. I will tell you that the next 17 chapters or so, we're going to be reading about sacrifices and the temple cult that we don't do anymore. We haven't done it for 2,000 years. We haven't offered sacrifices. So it's a fair question to ask, and I will ask it before any of you do. Why do we still read this? Why do we care about this? What purpose does this possibly have to recount the way our ancestors worshiped? That's a fair question, and it's an obvious question that people will ask. And so I want to ask it, and I want to start off with it. And again, hopefully you can join us over the next few weeks as we read Vayikra, Leviticus, and Vayikra in Hebrew, the book. It begins with the words Vayikra El Moshe, the Lord called to Moses. Now that the Mishkan is built, now that the tabernacle is finished, and the things are ready for being used, we jump into them being used. This is a tough thing to study, even in the best of circumstances when we're sitting around a table. But I will tell you, there's a very interesting tradition that we have. We have this amazing list of sacrifices, and we're going to look at some of them right now. The rabbis who wrote the Talmud was composed between about 200 BCE and about 500, 600 of the Common Era. So it was written over several hundred years. And over that period of time, from the time the Mishnah, the first part of the Talmud, was written, all the way through the Gemara, when it was finished, a version of it finished in Jerusalem, in Israel, and another version, a separate version, finished in Babylonia. During that time, the temple was destroyed. And so the Talmud is recounted, and it has entire tractates, entire books of the Talmud are written after the temple was already destroyed. So after the laws of the Torah were not even being able to be followed, the rabbis engaged in discussions about these priestly implements, the vestments, the clothing, the things that they used, the dimensions of the temple when it was built. Very intricate, very detailed discussions on these things, even after it was destroyed. And so they knew that this was an exercise, not in futility, but it was an exercise in holiness. And there was a reason why they studied this. In one of the teachings, we have a teaching, very famous teaching from Rav Ami, who is a rabbi who lived in about the second end of the 200s into the 300s of the Common Era, so towards the end of the Talmud period. He lived in Babylonia and he lived in Jerusalem. He lived in both communities. And he said very powerfully that when we study the laws of the offerings, when we study the sacrifices and we study the laws of the priests, it's as if we're doing the work ourselves, that the study of it takes the place of actually doing it. And the vast majority of Jews today, the vast majority of Jews in the world today, have no desire to go back to a pre-rabbinic form of Judaism, a form of Judaism where people would actually be offering these sacrifices. Not all, and again, we know there's a small segment of Jews that would like to see sacrifices be reintroduced, but most don't. One of the things we need to be reminded of, and as we begin this section, to remind you that when we study this, we are actually reenacting this in a non-bloody way, in a way where we don't have to sacrifice the animals, but by studying it, by engaging in reflection on what they're doing, and of course that later becomes also praying, that we're actually doing the same work that they did, that we're actually becoming, to some extent, priests ourselves by studying this and by engaging in the study of the sacrifices. Now, again, you might say, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to engage in sacrifices. But understand, and you're going to see why we did this. We didn't sacrifice because we wanted to kill animals. On the contrary, people didn't want to kill their livestock. It wasn't something that people necessarily wanted to do because it made sense for them from a standpoint of their livelihood. They're giving up something of value. They're sacrificing. The reason they did it was because they're fulfilling the commandment and they're being holy. And so these first 17 chapters essentially teach us how to be holy. The rest of the book of Vayikra, the second half of it, is what we call the holiness code. And it's really the way that we continue to be holy. We maintain our holiness. And so the sacrifices, to some extent, at the very beginning of Leviticus, the beginning of Vayikra, these next 4 or so, 5 chapters, really teach us how to purify ourselves, how to make ourselves, how to attain a sense of holiness. And then the rest of the Leviticus, and to some extent the rest of the Tanakh, or the rest of the Bible, really teaches how to maintain that. The hope is that we don't have to offer sacrifices for atonement, for example, which we are commanded to do. You're going to see it at Yom Kippur sacrifices. You'll see those laid out. We hopefully don't have to do those, but really once a year, these atonement type sacrifices. Or again, you know, we'd have to do them when we made mistakes, but hopefully we don't get in a situation where we have to do them. We maintain a sense of holiness, and that's the ideal situation to be in, not to come out of the state of being holy. And so the line in Vayikra that we get a lot after these first 17 chapters is, to you kadosh, that you have to be holy. You be holy. You stay holy. And the word is ki kadosh ani, because I'm holy, because God says I'm holy, and I want you to stay holy. And so the idea is not to continuously having to make sacrifices, with the exception of the daily sacrifices, the daily offerings that are made, but that you really hopefully don't fall out of this holiness. And so that's the goal. The goal is to stay holy. And if we unfortunately come out of that status, if we stop kind of being at that level, and it really is a level, that we have a way of getting back, that we can come back and we can be purified and we can go back to a state of holiness if we step out of that, if we come out of that, if we take ourselves out of it, willingly or unwillingly. And so keep that in mind as we go through this the next few weeks. And hopefully, again, you can be with us as we go through these chapters and take a look at Vayikra, at Leviticus, which again, in the Greek and then in the Latin, it is the laws of the Levites. But it clearly isn't just about the Levites, as we're going to see. The laws of the Levites are definitely a big part of this, but it's clearly not just for the Levites. And it's the reason why we have this section for everybody. Whether you're a Levite or not, you studied these laws. You didn't have, the majority of people were not Levites. They were not Kohanim. They were not that subset of the Levites that were the priests. Everybody was supposed to study this. And again, according to tradition, I just want you to know, when young people were supposed to start their studies of Torah as children, they were actually supposed to start with Vayikra. They were not supposed to start at the beginning with Genesis. The tradition that the rabbis lay out, and again, rabbis laying this out after the temple has been destroyed, after these sacrifices are not offered anymore, they tell us that we're supposed to start teaching children these laws. And the reason is because if you start off with the narrative, you start off with the stories, you miss the point of why those stories are there. The stories are there to help us be better people. And what is the most profound way to be a better person? To worship and to pray and to live your life with a sense of holiness. The stories are there to help us be reminded of why we have to stay holy. But to be holy and to have a direction, that's the most important. That's again, it's hard for us to remember that or to deal with it because we don't think about sacrifices anymore. But the concept of having a connection to God is something that we do understand. And we understand maybe, again, it's not as sexy, it's not as exciting as Genesis. It's not, the narratives are not, there's very few narrative in Leviticus, very little narrative, very little story, very little dialogue. But it really is, again, kind of, it's the middle book of the Torah, of the 5 books. And it's almost, again, as if this is this is kind of the manual for how to live your life. And everything else is, again, to make you pay attention to that manual so that you you don't need to fix yourself that much. But this is how you do it. And so it begins the words Vayikra. Moses, God called Moses and spoke to him from Ohel Moed, from the tent of meeting, the tent that again now is a holy place. And it says, God said, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any of you presents an offering of cattle to the Lord, you shall choose his offering from the herd or from the flock. And so immediately we jump into the laws and the guidance of how to sacrifice. But many people have pointed out that look at the very beginning. It doesn't begin the normal way, the traditional way, as Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, or Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, and God spoke to Moses, or God said to Moses, or this is what God said to Moses. It says God called Moses, Vayikra. And the word, the root kara, to call, to read, to say out loud, is a different verb. It's the word that we use when we say we're reading the Torah. We say Baal Koreh is the person who chants the Torah at the synagogue. Wasn't necessarily the Chazan. There was oftentimes a person who was the Baal Koreh, the owner of reading. It's also the root for the word in Arabic, Quran. So the word kara is a very important verb, but it's not the normal verb. It's not the normal way that God speaks. And so it's been said, it's been pointed out that what happens here is that Moses is called by God directly. And in this calling, in this singling him out, we see an intimacy between God and Moses that the Bible wants to reinforce here and to remind us that, again, it's not just that Moses was lit up, but that God was really chosen, God had really chosen Moses and singled him out to give these laws. Even though these laws are not for him necessarily, they're for the priests and for the rest of the Levites and really not for him, that he's the one that the law is being imparted to. And it's been pointed out, and some of you know this, some of you don't, but you're all going to learn this. The aleph in the word Vayikra is written very small in the Torah. It's a scribal tradition that every time, and again, you don't see it here because it's not showing us the way it's written in the Torah, but I will show you the way it's written in the Torah with a small aleph, because I have the ability to show it up on the screen right now. You're going to see it in just a second. But I do want you to be able to visualize it. So let me just get another. See, can't even see how I type. Let me show you. It is.
There it is.
You can see it up there. So this is the way the Torah. This is the way that the Torah.
Yes.
Vayikra. You can see the small aleph there. And that's the way the Torah, the scribal tradition for a long time has been written, with that small aleph. So the tradition is that there was a debate between Moses. Everybody has the Torah back up. Yeah. There was a debate between God and Moses on how this book was going to begin. So the question is Moses didn't like, in his humility, he didn't like the fact that God was going to say, I called Moses. And so Moses says, no, I want it to be Vayikar. I want it to say, and it happened that Moses was called, and it happened that God spoke to Moses here. rather than the Lord called, that the Lord happened to Moses and spoke to him, which would be Vayikar. And God said to Moses, no, everybody will know that I called you. Everybody needs to know that I called you. And it's important for them to know it. And so they compromised. They split the difference, and that Moses got his way a little bit by having the small olive. But the small olive was small to remind us of his humility. That small olive, when we see it, is supposed to remind us that Moses wanted to have a smaller role in the story. But let's take a look beyond that, beyond the first line. But there have been whole Devar Torahs written on that small olive, what it teaches us. So what we have here in chapter 1 is right away, as I said, it jumps into cattle that are presented as an offering. And you can see that when the cow or the bull is being slaughtered, it says that he shall offer the blood, dashing the blood on all sides of the altar, which is the tent of meeting. Teaches us that the blood itself becomes part of the purification. That the blood was necessary for that. That there was a need for the blood, not just the sacrifice. Kind of goes against our ideas of what is sanitary. Definitely, as we're cognizant of that today, this is almost the opposite of having a sanitary experience with somebody. And then you can see that the burnt offering is flayed and cut into sections. And it says, the sons of Aaron shall put fire on the altar and lay out the wood upon the fire. And they shall lay out the sections with the head and the suet on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. It goes through this very graphic description of it. But what's interesting about this is that it's not there. These directions are here for a very important reason, which is it creates smoke. The fat being burned there actually creates an optical effect, not just a scent, not just a visual, but also, again, not just a smell, but actually a visual too. So it's an important thing that the visual was part of the sacrifices. It wasn't just the smell. It wasn't just the action. That the senses are really being put into play here. It then goes on to say, if the offering is from the flock of sheep or goats, again, like the cow, it should be a male without blemish. And again, dashing its blood on the sides of the altar. Also cut up into sections, creating fire. Very similar. So that's the next level of sacrifice. Then it says, if the offering is of birds, turtle doves or pigeons, and again, the direction for the way it's supposed to be offered.
Pinch off its head.
Yes.
Yep, and the blood shall be drained. Again, there's got to be a little bit of blood out of it for the purification, for making the altar pure.
I don't like this.
Well, it's it's very graphic, and it teaches us that, again, you're upset by it. I'm a vegetarian. Come on. This is for me.
But
This is.
they just pinching its head, and it's.
I know. Well, we had to give people directions on what to do with a bird, because a bird doesn't seem to present the same type of the challenges, if you will, of it's not that much to slaughter on the bird. Let's put it that way. And And then the next thing it says is when a person presents an offering of meal to the Lord, his offering shall be of choice flour. He shall pour oil upon it and lay frankincense on it. So that will smell too. And it says the priest shall scoop out of it a handful of its choice flour and make it for the offering. And the remainder of the meal offering shall be for Aaron his sons, a most holy portion for the Lord's offerings by fire. And then it says when you present an offering of meal baked in an oven, you can see it should be unleavened cakes. It's halot matzot. We're getting right into the matzah time. It's perfect timing to be reading this. And again, how that's supposed to be offered. So you can see all of these things, we have directions for how these things are supposed to be offered up. There's an interesting progression that happens here. And it's been pointed out that we start off with the most expensive offering and we go all the way down through the animals, from a cow to the goats, sheep, to a bird, to the birds that could be offered, to meal, to the grains that could be offered. And so we go from the most expensive to the least expensive. But what it teaches us is that all of these offerings were acceptable. That God didn't want to create a situation where people would not have the ability, because of money, to take part in worship. So there were sacrifices that were based on people's monetary ability. Now there's definitely sacrifices that were offered on behalf of the people, that were offered up during the day, on the holidays, on Shabbat, that were offered up by the priest for everybody. And those were bulls, and those were the most expensive types of offering. And also goats, and also meal. They offered up a little bit of everything. But when people offered up an offering, that they had this ability to offer up based on their ability, based on what they could offer monetarily. And so there's something very powerful in that. And it might have been unique amongst ancient religions, ancient traditions, that people had, there wasn't a barrier of income for people to take part in the ritual. And that's pretty substantial. That's something that again, when we talk about what we take away from these laws of sacrifice, one of the things I hope everybody takes away is that these were not your typical sacrifices that we read about in the ancient world. That these were sacrifices that allowed for purification. They allowed for people to offer when something good had happened for them, for the holidays, for celebration, for Thanksgiving. These were opportunities for people to be holy, to be connected to God at the times that they needed to the most, at happy days and more challenging days too. And so there was this sense that, yeah, we know people are going to want to have an expression of their spirituality. And in the ancient world, that was done through sacrifice. But what was unique amongst the Jewish people was that we had the ability to do it based on your income. Yet everybody could do it. And there wasn't a barrier. There's also something that really important for us to remind people, that these sacrifices that were offered for about 1,200 years or so, 1,300 years, we offered up sacrifices. We haven't for the last 2,000 years. So for most of Jewish history, we have not been performing sacrifices, 2/3 of our history. But for 1,300 years, we did. And for most of that time that we sacrificed, every culture sacrificed that we know of offered up some type of sacrifice to the
Virgins.
And a very important point is that most of those cultures that we've got archaeological record of around the world, I mean, everybody talks about the Aztecs and gruesome sacrifices that they did there, but around the world, people offered up human sacrifices. We found human sacrifice evidence all across Europe, up past the time the Talmud, past the time that we didn't offer up animal sacrifices. People were still being offered up as sacrifices in Europe. there were literally not a continent where people lived where there weren't human sacrifices as the norm. And it may not have been every day. It may have been on special occasions where people offered up the human sacrifice. But it was unique that Judaism, at an early time in our history, made a very firm commitment against any type of human sacrifice for any reason. But because every reason you can find that you'd offer up a sacrifice, you offer up an animal or grain. And so it's an interesting thing to think about. Every time we enter into this point in the Torah, every time we enter Leviticus, we're confronted with the difficulty of why do we read this? Why did we even offer up sacrifices? And it was Maimonides literally 800 years ago, almost 900 years ago, and 900 years after the temple was destroyed. So Maimonides lived almost midway between the destruction of the temple and our own day. And Maimonides wrote that the reason that the temple was destroyed was because human beings didn't have to offer up sacrifices anymore. Jews didn't have to offer up sacrifices because humanity had evolved to a point where they didn't need it anymore. And so God essentially allowed the temple to be destroyed and not to be rebuilt because we don't need it anymore. And so Maimonides actually argued that when the Jews were ready to build a third temple, or when God was ready for us to have a third temple, there wouldn't be any animals anymore to be sacrificed. They wouldn't have to be sacrificed.
So now we send a check.
Well, we make a sacrifice. And the interesting thing is how much is that sacrifice? You know, do we feel that when we make a sacrifice, do we feel it? And that's an interesting thing that we will talk about when we get into some of the specifics of these sacrifices, is how much hurt did it cost? Did it inflict on people? How much was this cost for them? Because it was substantial. For some people, it would have been a substantial cost to make up these sacrifices. And again, there were different levels so that people were not rendered impoverished by the sacrifices. And so there was a level that almost everybody could feel like they had done something. And it's a very important idea in Judaism. We'll talk about it in the coming weeks, that when we make a sacrifice, when we make an offering, when we offer tzedakah, when we give something of ourselves, whether it's money or time, that we feel it, that we should be able to, it should have some effect on us. If we don't feel an effect, we probably not a sacrifice, but that we all can give within our means. And we teach, we believe that even the most impoverished person should be able to give something. We don't want to take that away from them. So if we have an event, or if we do something as a synagogue, as a community, we always tell people, look, you know, if you have nothing, of course, you know, you don't, but if you have $5 and you want to come to a Seder, we're gonna have you do it. If you can do that, because we want you to feel like you've contributed to something, that you've actually done something. It gives people a sense of pride. And so we're taught that even a schnorrer, even a professional schnorrer, right? There were people who literally went around begging for money, that even a beggar has to give tzedakah. Even a beggar has to have a sense of dignity, that they can offer something, that they can give something back. Because you don't take that away from somebody. You don't take the ability for somebody to have that sense of giving something of themselves. So this is a concept. This is something that's going to be reinforced in the next few weeks, of why we enter into holiness, why we try to get into holiness, and then how do we maintain that? And we'll get into that in the second half of Leviticus, where we read the holiness code, and we start getting into rules that help us maintain that behavior, more into the behavior of how we do that. Let's look a little bit further in the last 10 minutes or so. We're going to look at some of the other commandments in this too. Let's take a look at. Let's see what we can read here. So the first few chapters are kind of about just general sacrifices. And so then we get into we get into specific sacrifices that would be offered. And so in chapter 4, we read a portion that really reminds us of Yom Kippur. Speak to the Israelite people thus: when a person unwittingly incurs guilt in regard to any of the Lord's commandments about things not to be done and does one of them, so violates what we call a negative commandment. If it says thou shalt not and he does it, if it is the anointed priest who has incurred guilt so that the blame falls upon the people, he shall offer for the sin of which he is guilty a bull of the herd without blemish as a sin offering to the Lord. He shall bring the bull to the tent of meeting before the Lord and lay his hand upon the bull. The bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord, and the anointed priest shall take some of the bull's blood and bring it to the tent of meeting. And he dips his finger into the blood and sprinkles it 7 times. Again, we read this at Yom Kippur. The priest shall take some of the blood of the horns. And by the way, here's where we get the word horns. Oftentimes, the word karnot or karen, like we had karen or, karnot hamizbeach, the horns of the altar. That's clearly the horns, the tips of the altar that stuck out on the corners. Those were horns. And the priest puts some of the blood on the horns, on all the horns. And it goes through what he takes out of it, what's sacrificed, essentially the bad parts of it. You don't burn those. You don't burn the parts that are, I wouldn't say the disgusting parts, because to me it's all disgusting, but the intestines, some of these things like the dung, obviously, you carry outside the camp and you burn it in fire. You don't burn it on the altar. And so if a priest sins, he sacrifices a bull. But here's what it says. If it is the whole community of Israel that has erred, and the matter escapes the notice of the congregation so that they do any of the things which by the Lord's commandment they're not supposed to do, and they realize the guilt, they offer a bull on the sin as a sin offering and bring it before the Lord. It says the elders of the community shall lay their hands upon the bull, so the head of the bull, so they're actually doing something themselves, and they slaughter it. And so this is a bull that takes on the sins and as expiation, fixes the problem. And again, the same type of directions, and it actually says, just as was done with the bull for the priest offering, you shall do the same with it. Then it goes on, in the case of a chieftain, but one individual, not the whole community, but the head of a tribe, if he's done something, he shall bring a male goat without blemish. So you can see what happens to the individual is he doesn't have to bring a bull, he brings a goat. And so assumedly the chief of the community is wealthier, so goat is expensive. It's not as expensive as a bull, and it's not a community-wide problem. He's bringing something smaller, but he brings something substantial, but not as big as the priest or on behalf of the community. And then it goes through the same directions that we had with the previous sacrifices. And then here's what happens to a normal person, not a priest, not a chief, not the whole community, but it says if any person from among the populace unwittingly incurs guilt by doing anything of the things which the Lord's commandments ought not to be done and realizes his guilt, or the sin of which he is guilty is brought to his knowledge. So either he realizes it or somebody points it out to him, it's brought to his knowledge, shall bring a female goat without blemish as his offering. He shall lay his hand upon the head of the sin offering, and the sin offering shall be slaughtered in that place. What it tells us is that bringing a female goat, and again, it's not a very feminist interpretation, but female goats were not as valuable as a male goat. Almost all the sacrifices that were offered were male animals, bulls, male goats. And those were expensive because, again, people use those animals to procreate. and they had a higher value. So it is a less valuable version of the same animal. And here's the last one here that we'll look at. If a person incurs guilt when he has heard a public imprecation, and although able to testify as one who has either seen or learned the matter, he does not give the information so that he is subject to punishment. And then it goes on, or when a person touches any unclean thing, so something that's a carcass of an unclean beast, or even of something that was, again, not killed in a kosher way, or if he touches any human uncleanness. I want to just look at this part right here, which is that when somebody does something wrong, he has a way of fixing it. But there's another issue here, is that a person can incur guilt when he knows of something and he doesn't come forth with the information. This is a very important Jewish idea, and we're going to finish with this today. Judaism teaches us not only we're going to read it in this book of Leviticus, a lot about sacrifices, has a lot about human behavior. We're not supposed to stand idly by when our neighbor suffers. But it goes even beyond that. We are not allowed to withhold information of something that was done wrong. If we know about it, we have to come forward and say it. This is a whole nother level that I think some people don't recognize. That's a Jewish value. That we are obligated, and if we don't, we become responsible for it. This is, essentially a whistleblower, but it's even deeper in our Jewish tradition. Not only are we not punished, that's essentially what whistleblower laws are there for, which, by the way, some of those, as you know, are fairly new laws in our books. Not only are there laws in our country to encourage people to come forward, Judaism is on the other side of this issue, that your problem is actually, if you didn't come forward, you're guilty. So it comes at it from a completely different approach than we have as Americans, which is that you're actually under obligation to come forward. It's you incur guilt if you don't. So it's not, well, we hope you don't get punished for it, and we're going to try to keep laws to keep you from being held accountable for it. You don't really have a choice. And so Judaism really stresses this responsibility that we have. And it's an example of the responsibility, the value of responsibility that Judaism teaches us. That we don't have the ability to say, it's not my problem. It is your problem, and you're responsible for it if you don't do it. It's a really different approach, and it's one that I wish we had in our society. I really do. To start from the standpoint of, no, it's on you if you don't come forward, not you come forward and you won't be punished. No, if you don't come forward, then you're essentially liable for punishment. So it's a very different approach to responsibility, communal responsibility that we have in Judaism. And so again, I kind of want to finish on that. It's not the highest part of what we talked about today. It's not the most encouraging and hopeful, which is that, hey, we built something and we should be happy coming together. That's a great positive lesson. But there's another lesson here which I hope we focus on, which is that we're responsible for each other. And that is really important right now to go out tonight thinking about. We think about, hopefully, and we'll salute and recognize and celebrate all the great things that people do, especially those doctors, and again, to appreciate our teachers and the people who we oftentimes in the grocery stores don't think a lot about. But really importantly, right now, we got to think about what our responsibilities are to our community. And Judaism doesn't let us off the hook on this. We have a tremendous responsibility to do what we can for our community, and to be responsible for them, and to not walk away from that responsibility. when it comes to taking care of our health, our community health, but also to take care of people and not say, to turn around and say, hey, it's not my problem. So please keep that in mind. Stay healthy, stay safe. Join us, please, on Friday night. We're going to, again, broadcast stream at 5 o'clock. And last time we had a little problem at 8 o'clock. We had too much going on at 8 o'clock. And so we went down for about 10 minutes. After that, we were fine. But and it's up still if you want to watch last Friday. But we're working on a completely different Friday night service. We're not completely different melodies. It's going to be the same Friday night prayers, but some new melodies and some new voices, by the way, too. You're going to hear some voices that you never heard before. We have a new voice in addition to Alyssa, in addition to Kenny that you're going to hear a new voice too. So it's just a nice surprise. I promise you'll, I can't promise. Everybody has different, I'm pretty sure you'll like it. So another young, really talented Jewish musician. So that you'll hear. So with that, take care, everybody. And thanks for part of this study session tonight. And it will be here in case you want to go back or tell somebody, hey, this is what we studied.
Yeah,
So,
if you want to read about slaughtering animals and
we did that
sprinkling their blood.
very little bit of tonight. It was as small as we can. So again, everybody, stay healthy and join.
Mark, is there more in Leviticus about dead animals and
Yes,
stuff?
the whole thing's about that.
You're saying that to your husband, he'll tell you. I promise you, we're going to make it as relevant and as little little about just the sacrifice.
Entrails and ugh.
It's there.
Blood and guts and gore and veins in my teeth.
I promise you that you always learn something relevant from it. And again, look at that last line. Not to forget that as Jews, we're responsible for testifying. It's something that we'd pass by it if you don't want to read anything about entrails, you'd pass by that line in the Torah. And so I promise you there'll be something every week in the next few weeks. So the next 4 weeks or so, a lot about sacrifices, but especially in the coming weeks, you're going to see some important, I think, really relevant lessons. Some things that we still need to learn as modern people, if you will. Even in these ancient ways, some pretty important modern lessons. So we'll see everybody. Again, thank you everybody for being a part. And again, don't hesitate to jump in the future. If you have a question or a comment, you can also chat it out. Or as we saw, you can raise your hand or do that too. So thanks everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Sei gesund, as we say in Chinese, Mandarin. Bye-bye.
Bye.